So we're talking about value and we're creating black and white shape compositions this week. So value is really just darks and lights. We also call it shades and tints in color theory. So similar values can unify elements in a composition while different values can add contrast. We're beginning with just black and white paint before we add color so we can really focus on values and how they play such an important role in strong compositions. So once you start adding into color and trying to mix different values in color, it can look really it can be really difficult because like a dark yellow is going to look really different than a dark red or a dark blue. So taking out the color part of it and just using black and white is going to give us a better understanding of how value works. And it's one of these foundational things for strong compositions. So it's going to get you ready to use color in a really intentional and skillful way. When we're thinking about darks and lights in a composition, generally darks will push back in space, so recede back into the background more, while lighter tones will pop forward and we'll see them more and start to notice that as we look through some of the different artworks in this slide presentation. So while we're looking at this art, we're especially taking note of the values. I desaturated the image to focus on the values. So basically I took the color out and made them black and white. Your project is going to be in grayscale, so you understand these value tools before adding color. So I want you to notice how even though these artworks are in color, the originals, they really have a strong balance of values of darks, lights, and midtones. So that makes them such great compositions. So this is Stuart Davis. He was an American artist, and you can see on the top, this is a very colorful painting. It's an oil painting on canvas, and I chose it also because it has a lot of shapes in it, so it's similar to what we're doing. And when we take away the color, when we desaturate it, it holds up as a composition. And so this is really a measure of a good composition, is if you can take away the color and it looks balanced and it looks strong and interesting. So we can see there's those very dark blacks, there's some light lights, and then there's a range of midtones as well. And it's all balanced throughout the composition. This is Bridget Riley, and the top is a study she did, which I always love when I can find artist studies or sketches. I get excited about them, and we can see that she's working out the colors and she's working on graph paper. And this is called op art. It's like optical illusions. And we can really see here how the lighter tones are moving forward and the darker tones are going back. And she creates these really cool optical illusion paintings in the 60s. And on the top in her study, it is in gouache, which is what we'll be working in. And a lot of artists, gouache is a way to work really quickly and get your ideas down. So I always get excited too when I can find artists using gouache because I think it's an awesome medium. This is Aaron Douglas, who we've learned about. He was one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance movement, and he created this cover for the Crisis magazine, which still exists. It's the NAACP magazine. This is from 1927. But this illustration, we can see the use of value and shape, these repeated shapes in the center that create this kind of movement, that repetition and movement that we see. This image has a lot of energy to it, and it's very simple shapes, which works as an illustration, right? It's going to catch people's attention. Okay, we're also going to learn about figure and ground relationships. So that is the relationship between the subject, which for us is going to be shapes, that's called the figure, and the background, which is called the ground. So it's really how your shapes in your composition relate to the background. Now in like historical artwork and representational art, usually the subject was a human figure, which is why we have this term figure ground, and we just take the back out of background. So I want to kind of demystify some of these art terms for you. So in abstract art, in our non-representational art, the figure just becomes the shapes or the objects, or the subject, whatever you want to call it. And I want you to start to think about, is there a separation between your shapes and the background? Or do you want the shapes to blend in and become part of the background? Either way is fine. I just want you thinking about that relationship between what's in your background and what your shapes are and how they work with each other. You can add similar values, textures, lines, shapes, etc. In the background to relate to those shapes in the foreground, the figure, basically. So similar elements like we've been talking about, this unification and contrast, which is always great to have in a composition, creates a strong composition, and you can have a balance of both. So similar elements are going to unify, while different elements create contrast. So similar values unify, and different values create contrast, and the same with any other thing you add to the figure or the ground, like texture, line, all that kind of stuff. The repeated shapes that we saw in the Aaron Douglas crisis piece. So I also want you to start thinking about how the figure ground relates to the negative and positive space in creating a strong composition. Each week we're building on different skills. So how can you use these two concepts together to make a strong composition? You don't have to answer any of this, obviously. I just want you to start thinking about this as you're creating work. So now we're going to look at some art to show you what the figure-ground relationship looks like in art. And we're going to start by looking at an actual figure as it relates to the background. And then I'm going to move into showing you some abstract and non-representational pieces that use the figure-ground relationship so you can see how you can use it in your compositions. So this is Romare Bearden. He was an African-American artist, and this is the Woodshed in 1969. I get excited about this piece because it's also some cut paper, and he's using graphite and sprayed ink. It's a really lot of different materials here. So we have the color piece on the bottom, and then I've desaturated it and made it black and white so you can really get a sense of the values up on the top. And there's a lot that goes into this painting, but we're going to focus on this artwork, we're going to focus on the figure ground. So we have the actual figures, the human figures of these two people here and how they relate to the background. We can see some different shapes and textures happening. We can see some negative space like around the woman sitting that's kind of framing her. We can see how they're connected and disconnected from each other. So how the figures are popping out from the background, and then how the background is helping to complete the composition and make certain elements pop out. Like that light bulb and the woman being framed by that dark doorway or hallway, that's really making those elements sort of central to the composition. And I found this on the Metropolitan Museum of Art website. And he said Romare Bearden was studying Dutch paintings, 17th century Dutch paintings of Johannes Vermeer. And these are very realistic representational paintings. And you might not know that by looking at Romare Bearden's work. And that's why I love getting these quotes from artists, because he is saying that he's looking at these paintings and seeing the way the painters controlled their big shapes. So he's trying to lay out his composition thinking about these big shapes. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're breaking it down to really simple shapes and values and creating these relationships between the shapes and the backgrounds. And that's, those building blocks of the composition, of making a strong composition. Now we're moving into more non-representational. This is Miro, a Spanish artist, and I always thought it was a woman because in English it's a woman's name, but it's a man's name in Spanish. And I learned that from the MoMA, this is from the Museum of Modern Art, that Miro used collage to create these abstract works to help him get to these abstract forms. And that's exactly what we're doing, right? So, this has happened before. We're taking from the greats, right? And we're learning their process and making it our own so we can make strong compositions. So what Miro did on the collage, you can see on the left, he clipped out stuff from equipment magazines and machinery and newspaper ads and popular culture and put them in a collage. And then the collage was what he used to generate a spark, or a jolt is how he referred to it, to get to these larger paintings. And he always wrote the name of the painting and the date he finished it on the collage as well. So he was keeping track of what was inspiring him and what was giving him that spark or that jolt. And I just always loved, like, the Bridget Riley, sketch. I love seeing the artist process. And that's what we're really doing here in this class, is you're creating a process to get to your painting. The process is as important as the painting, right? How you get there, how you make it. This is Stuart Davis, and he didn't make collages, but he did make a still life where he nailed an egg beater, an electric fan, and a rubber glove to a table in his studio and used these unlikely items to create his first really abstract works. So he's starting from something in reality, taking these shapes and breaking them down. And this is another example when we take away the color, when we desaturate the painting, the image is still really strong because the values are there and the composition is there. There's a balance and there's an interest in it. And we can see the background just has kind of two shades on it. There's a lighter shade on top and a darker on the bottom. So that's breaking up the background. So it's not exactly floating. It's giving it some ground. And then the figure or the shapes are very separate from the background. There's not a lot relating to the background except maybe a little bit of the texture of the paint. So you don't have to make it any certain way. I just want you to start noticing you can have the background very separate, or like the Romar Bearden, you can have some elements in the background, related to the figures or the shapes in the foreground. I'll go back and kind of show you. So in the Bearden work, the background, there's some textures in the background and some big shapes in the background that are calling for our attention as well as the figure. And that is creating a relationship between the figures and the background. And then the Stuart Davis has a more separate relationship. There's still a relationship, right, between the shapes and the background, but they're a little more separated, and there's not things mimicking what are on the shapes in the background the way they are with the Bearden work. Again, you don't have to do it any certain way. This is all about you thinking about what you like, what kind of work you want to make. That's why I like to show you a lot of different examples. This is pencil gouache. I love that I can find all these gouache pieces and metallic paint on paper. And we can see the shapes that I would consider the figures in the figure ground relationship are these light shapes. And because they have really light values, and they're kind of empty the way they're filled in, they're popping forward to us and sitting on the surface. And then the darker, more textured shapes are pushing back. So this is a really good example. It's a very flat piece. There's not a lot of three-dimensionality here, but it's a lot of different shades, and it's a lot of different values and textures that are giving us so much interest and allowing our eye to move through the piece. And we can really see that figure ground relationship where they're connected, but they're separate, and these things take a while to sort of sink in. So if you're not completely understanding it, or if you have questions, just ask me. I'm happy to talk about it. It's more what you as the artist want to create. You're basically just thinking, how your shapes work with your background. And with this one, we're seeing these really kind of blank, empty, light shapes against a really more busy, darker background. So that's creating that contrast instead of more unifying the shapes and the figures with the background. Okay, I wanted to show you this evolution of Piet Mondrian's work from representational into abstraction and then into complete non-representational. So what we're doing is creating non-representational work from the collage, and I want you to see how other artists create work over time and how their work changes. Mondrian's recognizable objects that you'll see turn into abstracted objects which turn into completely flat shapes and lines. So what he's doing is breaking the composition down to its most simple forms. I want you to notice when we look at these, the changes in the figure-ground relationship and the values, and just think about how you can utilize some of these techniques in your own work, or just think about what you think about it if you think it's interesting. Mondrian was influenced by Cubism, which was an art movement by Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso. And the Guggenheim Museum says of Mondrian's work is he further reduced his colors and geometric shapes and formulated his non-objective neoplastic style. So by the end, what we think of as Mondrian paintings now are this neoplastic style. So on the top left, we're looking at a still life where we can recognize things. We can recognize books and glasses, and it's pretty, it's stylized and simplified, but we can still recognize the items. And then on the bottom, which was done about the same time, he's flattening it, and we can see the influence of the cubism here, where things are broken into very flat cubic shapes, but we can still see that blue vase as a sort of recognizable shape. And then we move into a couple years later, on the top left, it's getting very completely flat. There's a little bit of texture in here, a little bit of shading and values, but there is no recognizable objects. So it's pretty much non-representational. And then in the bottom right, we see what we recognize as Mondrian's work today, where it's completely flat, just shape and line and nothing else. So he's really changed the way he's creating work and thinking about values and shapes and lines over time. All right, so what you're going to be doing to prepare for your project, you're going to warm up and start just experimenting with the materials. We're using this paint for the first time. It could be completely new to you, or maybe you haven't painted since you were a kid. And so we're really just getting comfortable using the materials. You're going to make just lines and practice using opaque and transparent paint. And I'm going to demonstrate how to do all of that, adding water to it and adding water to the paper and the paint. And then you're going to make a grayscale value scale. You're going to use just the black and white gouache to make a value scale from dark to light, at least 7 different values, which includes the actual black and the actual white. And you'll use this scale to create different values in your actual painting. So it'll help you with your painting. So for your project, you're going to choose one composition from last week from your collage, from that Principles of Design cutout shape collage. And this is going to be a reference from your painting. You're going to paint your composition onto Bristol board or any other heavy paper like watercolor paper. And using just the black and white gouache paint, you're going to create a grayscale painting. So I want you to really think about developing that figure-ground relationship, and you're going to use unifying and or contrasting values. So you can use both, you can use one, it's totally up to you. You can do a combination. I also want you to think about creating depth and space by using lighter values to make those shapes move forward and darker values to make them move back. you're going to use this composition next week to create an even new painting in color. So I really want you to take your time and create something that you feel proud of and that you're going to work with again. All right, let's move on to the warm-up, and then your project demonstration will be in another video. All right, so if this is the first time you're using gouache paint, or if you haven't painted since you were a kid, I'm gonna show you the basics. You know, you don't really need a fancy setup. You can start really simply, and gouache is a really versatile paint that I think is great for beginner painters and advanced painters. All kinds of people use it. So I just love gouache. It's kind of a mix in between acrylic paint and watercolor, and you can make it really opaque and you can also make it transparent. So what I have here is a palette. This is a ceramic palette that I've had forever. You can use anything that will hold paint. So you can use those disposable palettes. You can use yogurt tops, yogurt containers. The top of takeout containers are actually really, really good for palettes. You can buy a plastic one. There's all kinds of options. And then I have a jar. It's a jelly jar that I use to hold water. And I have another jar that I just use to hold my paintbrushes, because when they're dirty or wet, I don't like to put them down on other stuff, or I always end up making a mess. This plastic thing is like a shower caddy. I think it's from the dollar store. I've had it forever, and it's meant to put in your bathroom. But I use it to hold all my materials because I am very clumsy and I tend to knock things over and splatter everywhere. So it kind of catches everything for me. This is an old dish towel that I use just to dry off my brushes or wipe off my brushes. And then I have my black and white paint here. The paper I'm working on is a Bristol board. So it's smooth, which is nice for gouache, but you can also work on watercolor paper or whatever you have. This is the stuff I'm working on. You know, your sketchbook paper or any other lighter paper, more thin paper, might buckle a little more, and that's fine. But you just it can get annoying if you don't like that. So a heavier weight paper like Bristol board or watercolor is going to hold the paint a little better. It won't hold a ton of water, but it's meant to hold up to adding water and paint to it. Okay, so we're just gonna squeeze a little bit out of the tube, and we're starting with black and white to create values before we add in color. So I'm squeezing out a little black, and I'm barely touching the edge of the tube to squeeze it out. And then I'm gonna get out a little white, and it is good to take care to close your tubes after, because they can dry out. So you wanna keep your paints happy and healthy. And we can always add more paint to our palette, but you can't put paint back in the tube. Like you can't put toothpaste back in the tube. So I do think it's good to just start with a little bit. So I'm gonna start with black because it'll be easier to see on my white paper. I have a dry brush here. You can use any brush you want. These shorter brushes are meant for like watercolor and ink because you're closer to the painting. And then you'll see brushes with like long handles, and those are meant for acrylic and oil painting. And that's because you're sitting up on an easel and like painting from further away. So it really doesn't matter, though all the brushes will work. It's totally your choice. I'm using these short handle brushes because I'm working really close to the paper. So I'm just dipping my brush into the black paint here. I have no water on my brush. My paper is dry, and I want you to just start experimenting with different lines. And we can see the paint, when it's really thick, is completely opaque. And then when there's less and less paint on the brush, we get this like fun kind of texture-y thing that you can play around with, which gives you a lot of interesting different values and textures. So practice with that's the paint right out of the tube. I can mix in, I'm gonna mix in some I'm just going to use the black that's on my brush and mix it in with a little bit of white in another part of my palette and see what that looks like. So we can make all different kinds of grays. And so just practice making some lines. So that's completely dry paint on dry paper. Well, the paint's not really dry, but it's out of the tube paint on dry paper. And now I'm going to clean off my brush and try getting the paper a little bit wet to see how that works when I add dry paint into the wet paper. So to clean my brush, I'm kind of like tapping it on the bottom of my jar, and then I usually like scrape it a little bit up the jar. And then I use this towel to kind of wipe it off. I don't know if that does anything, but it's just a habit. And then sometimes I'll wipe it on the edge of the jar to get out some of the excess water. But for what we're doing right now, getting the paper wet, kind of want a lot of water. So I have this wet brush and I'm just getting the paper a little bit wet. And then my brush is still wet, so I'm going to come in and pick up some black paint and put it into the wet paper. And that all this kind of awesome stuff happens. So when you have wet paint or wet paper and put a drier paint into it, you get different little fanning out where it's mixing with the water. So you can control that a little bit. I mean, a lot of this painting with water is about letting the paint do its thing and letting go and letting it be what it's going to be. But you can control it a bit by experimenting with how much water is on your paper, how much water is on your brush, how much water is on the paint that you have mixed. So I'm going to get a little bit more water and I'm going to make a gray color here, and I'm going to make a watery gray so we can see it's kind of filling up this whole section of my palette here. So I'm getting a pretty watered down color, and I'm going to apply that to dry paper. So I want you to try making watery color to dry paper. And then there's all these different combinations you can do. And you can see how this kind of watered down color is making a lot of different values and transparencies here. We can get really transparent if I'm dipping it in my brush in a little more water, and then I can just smooth that out, and look at how transparent that is. You can see through. So you can really do a lot with this paint, which was why I think it's so fun to use. So just spend a whole page experimenting with how this works. Now I haven't cleaned my brush, and I'm just dipping it in to the black that was right out of the tube, and I'm gonna come in and do that. And you can see, you can make notes. A lot of times I'll do this kind of page and just make notes, like have a pen or a pencil and point to something if I really like the way it looks, so I can remember what I did. But some of the stuff you just have to let happen. And then just keep going and seeing what works for you, what kind of lines you like. And you can do dry paint on top of dry paint, and all different levels of moisture on the paint or on the paper. So experiment with dry paint, wet paper, wet paint, wet paper, whatever you can think of. And I could do this all day. And then we can see how it's still picking up. There was a lot of paint over here, so we're picking up some of that. So just make a lot of different lines, make a mess, and experiment with all the different values and transparencies and opaqueness that you can get. And then the next step of the warm-up is going to be your value scale. So we're going to make 7 different values. You can create like boxes here, but I'm just going to make little paint brushes, and I'm going to number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm cleaning my brush. I'm actually going to start with a new brush. And my brush can be a little damp, but I'm not having it soaking wet. So I want pure black at one end. I'm going to clean that off. And I'm going to let that sit in there because of the black. And then I'm getting pure white at the other end, which is going to be hard to see with the paper. I know, but I'll know it's there. So what you do is you start adding a little bit of black to the white. If you started adding the white to the black, it would take a long time for it to show up. And this is the same as if you have yellow or a lighter color and you're wanting to darken it a little bit. You add the darker color slowly to the lighter color. So you'll see what I mean. Okay, so I'm taking the white here and I'm just gonna take a little bit and see how that black kind of blends in really quickly, and that's almost like too much. So I'm gonna keep, let's see, that might be like 3. So we're just going from light to dark so you can see all the different values. Now I'm mixing in with my original white, and I think that's going to be a better tone for here. Yes, that's better and lighter. So it took a lot more white to get to that lighter gray. You can make a little box around the white if you want. You could make up boxes in pencil too. And then we're just going to get progressively darker. So I'm taking just a tiny bit of black on there and adding it. And if it's getting really dry, you can add just like a dip of water. That looks like almost the same, so I need to add a little more black. And you can paint right over it. All right, I need to get a little more aggressive with my black. So I'm coming in with more. So I'm just adding black to the gray I already created. And then a very dark gray. I'm gonna get a little bit, it's drying out a little bit, so I'm adding water to help me mix. And I think I need even more black. There we go. That's very close to the black out of the tube. And this, I probably could have gone a little lighter. Let me see if I can get it even lighter. It does not have to be perfect. This is really just an exercise. There we go. I'm making an in-between. This is my 1.5. So there's no mistakes here. It's just all experimenting. And then what I always do when I have extra paint in my palette, because I hate wasting stuff, is I just go crazy and try different tones and shades and values and different brush strokes. And I'll just fill in. I always have like a practice page like this, whether it has a value scale or I'm testing out different shades and tones and colors. And I always kind of have something next to me where I can experiment and just make a mess and not care what it looks like, and I can throw it away later. But don't throw this away because you're gonna need it for your painting. So just have fun and finish out your paint and let go. It's gonna look like a mess, and that is the point. And it's kind of fun to just not care what it looks like. But do keep your value scale intact so you can use it when you paint your painting. All right, so when you're done with everything, you can rinse off all the paint from your brushes as well as you can in your jar of water or cup of water, whatever you have. I do recommend, if you're using a mug, do not drink out of it. This happens more often than you know. This is why I use jars and I use clear glass, because it's terrible to drink the paint water. And I don't want that to happen to you. So just be careful if you have a mug with coffee in it or tea and also a mug with your paint water in it. Keep them very separate somehow. So get off as much paint as you can. You can change your water several times in a sitting. Like if it's getting too dirty, you can just dump it out and put new water in. The nice thing about gouache is it's not toxic, so you don't have to worry about putting it down your sink. So what I do is I just keep this, this is like an old, it's plastic. It's a gelato jar with a nice screw top. And I keep this under my sink. I label everything just so I don't use it for other stuff. And this is like Ivory soap. The reason I use it, I just get the least expensive white soap. And I bring all this stuff into my sink and I put the palette down on the bottom, and then I have the water running. And with the water running, you can kind of wipe your brushes like this on the soap. And because it's white, you can see if there's still paint coming off. So I'll let the water run and wipe the brush until the soap looks clean and there's no more paint on my brush. And then I'll rinse, get all that soap out of there. And then I just use, this will have been under my brushes while I'm cleaning them the whole time. So a lot of the paint comes off, and then I'll just use my thumb, or you could have a sponge or something. Or sometimes I use the paint brushes to get the rest of this out, and it all comes out with water and a little bit of soap. So it's really easy to clean up. So I do recommend cleaning it up right away, because you can ruin your brushes and your stuff can get stuck on your palette. So it's just easier if you clean it up. That's why I kind of have this whole thing I can bring to the sink, and I keep my soap just under the sink labeled with paintbrush soap on the top, so no one else uses it in the house for anything else. And that's my simple way to get started painting. You don't need much, and just have fun with it.